Lately I've been looking at some of my early reviews of Civil War games, and I thought that Eric Lee Smith's game, The Civil War, published in 1983, deserved another look. But before I do that, I should tell you kind of my little personal history with Civil War strategic games. Civil War by Eric Lee Smith was my favorite game for a long time in the 80s. And when Mark Herman released in 2006 this other second edition of For the People by GMT, card-driven games were kind of really in vogue at that time, and I was seduced by it just like everybody else. I really liked For the People as a card-driven game. Fast forward now to 2015, and Mark Simonich's game U.S. Civil War came out, and I've been playing that solidly since 2015. I joined the staff game, and even now it's going into a third edition where some of the rules are being tweaked, and I'm looking forward to the reprint of that coming out. Now in 2018, I purchased The War for the Union, which is done by Rob Bama and published by Compass Games. Of the 4 Civil War games I've just shown you, this is the only one I've not tried at all. Mine is just punched and ready to play, but I have just not given it the attention it probably deserves, because U.S. Civil War is consuming most of my time right now. But lately I've been thinking a lot about Eric Smith's Civil War game, and I liked it a lot, and I thought it deserved another look. Maybe I can do a bit better video than I did back then. My camera work's got a bit better, and we'll just take a look at the game again and tell you what I think of it. Here is the basic board to the game, and in the next frame I'm going to show you what Eric calls the far west option, where you can attach a piece to the west edge of the map and show what happened in Texas and stuff like that. I'll just show you that now, but it does take a lot of room if you do play with the far west option. I usually don't. I'm quite content with the main game. Let's take a look. Now if you were playing with the far west option, you attach this piece on, and as you can see it takes quite a bit of space, and all your tracks and stuff are also on the same sheet. What I'm going to do is fold the west option up, just showing the tracks, and show you the way the game I usually play it. I have played once with the far west option, and it's interesting, but I don't think as a simulation of the Civil War it adds too much. Most of the campaigns in this area are decided by very small forces, but I just don't have the space to play it that way. So let me show you what it looks like set up with just the tracks. As you can see, set up this way, the game takes up much less space, and I can put my flyaway down there, and just takes less space. Now the original rule book has 56 pages. It is illustrated, and I found it quite comprehensive back in '83. I had no trouble with it. But it is not an easy game to learn. This is not a beginner's game, but for those of you who are interested in the Civil War, it's one of the best out there. Now over the years, several individuals have got together and produced a more comprehensive, expanded rulebook. This one comes in at, I think it's 66 pages. Yeah, 66 pages. It's got new setups, some optional rules, and they've changed some things, added leaders. I keep it mainly for the clarifications that it gives to some of the cases that might come up in your game. They're not quite explained in the original rules. I did like the new leaders that they produced. I'll show you those, but I do not like all of the leader options. So I'm in between these two rule books. I still very much like to play the original game as Eric designed it, and yet I do like the clarifications that exist in this game. Plus I do like the new counters. I'll show you those close up. Now these are the original counters to the game. The Union were white with blue lettering, and they were fairly legible. The Confederates, on the other hand, were dark red with black lettering, not always that easy to read. Even on the Union, sometimes when you got leaders like Fremont with the special characteristics here in red, the red kind of overpowered the blue. Also, we can see from the die cutting at the time, they were not as good as the counters we have today. You can see a lot of flash on the side. And, well, there were counters that were perfectly serviceable, but I think the counters that some of the fans have made are superior, and I'm going to show you some of those. Okay, here are some of the fan-produced counters. I got these, I think, off of Board Game Geek, and I think you'll agree that they are much more clear than the original ones. They, you can make them double-sided. I've trimmed them and I've made the best counters I can. Making double-sided counters is always problematic. It's not easy, and my matchups on the back are not always perfect, but for game purposes they're perfectly serviceable. I said double-sided counters are always tricky to make. At least they're tricky to make for me anyway. But I think these counters are quite nice. And in the video that I'm going to show you, I'll be using these counters. So, to get the parameters straight, what I show you in the video will be the original game, as Eric Lee Smith designed it, and with these new counters. But I'm not going to use all of the optional leader counters that the fans added. And I'll tell you why. Now, in a very quick view, these are some of the optional leaders you get. As you can see, there's a heck of a lot of them. And many of them are one-star generals at the very, very low level. And they created these leaders because they created or changed some of the basic rules of the game, something I don't quite agree with, or I don't want to play with them, some of these option rules. I mean, you get a counter for Quantrill, you get a counter for leaders I've never even heard of, and I've been reading the Civil War for 30, 40 years. I'm afraid I don't know who General Marmaduke is. A lot of them I do recognize, you know, like Sibley and Warren and Buckner, and you get Fitzjohn Porter, there's good old Doubleday. But these are all one-star leaders, very low-level leaders. And with the new rules, they add elements that were not in the original game. In the original game, the key components in the game are the armies. There's reasons to create armies, and that's why you create them. But in this game, if you've got leaders all over the board running around that can do whatever they want, I think you're getting away from the original game. So I do not play with the optional leaders. I do play with the new counters, but not the optional ones. Also, he's created many more armies. Army of the MSG, okay, and other ones. As you can see, I haven't even printed out and made a lot of the optional leaders. I don't play with them. Army of the Shenandoah, Army of the Ohio, Army of the Frontier. I don't play with those extra armies. I think they've changed the game too much, in my opinion. And yet I do respect the work they've done on those rules. They've done a wonderful job in clarifying a lot of obscure points. Now in Stuka Joe's videos, you can see that he made some fancy army counters, and I thought they were very well done. So I tried to do my own too. I made some circular ones, and boy, as I found out, making circular counters is not easy. Anyway, these are the original counters to the game. This is what they look like. They were kind of basic. Again, the font was small, and we have to be aware of the printing processes at the time in 1983. They didn't have a lot of guarantee of the edge of the counter, so the font had to be smaller. Now I've done these on a home printer. They're the best I can make. I just wanted something distinctive when you play the game to show that it was an army. Because I think that's what Eric is trying to emphasize in his game, that the armies, he's chosen four for each side, really made the difference in the Civil War. It's the movement of armies that are going to decide this game, not corps. So let's set up the game with the 1861 start and see how she goes. Okay, this is the setup for 1861, and we'll be zooming in and looking at the particulars in a moment. and your general records track. Now Eric's game here has got quite a lot of information on the general records track. I should say at the outset that this will not be a training video showing you how to play the game. I would refer you to Stuka Joe's very fine videos on how to play Civil War. In his videos, I think he does a two-part video where he shows you how to play the entire turn one of the game. So if you want to learn the game, I highly suggest you watch one of Stuka Joe's videos. Now it's inevitable that people will compare Mark Simonich's U.S. Civil War with Eric Lee Smith's The Civil War. They're decades apart, and even before Mark Simonich's game came out, several misinformed people were under the false belief that it was a remake of this game. It is not a remake. It's an entirely different game. Two different designers, very prolific designers, but they're two different games. Having said that, they share many common characteristics. For example, the scale in both of them is each hex represents approximately 25 miles, and each strength point represents about 5,000 men. But beyond that, there are radical differences in the two. And as I show you certain things in the Civil War, I will inevitably make reference to Mark Simonich's design. And it's not an attempt to show that one is better than the other. Inevitably, people will ask you, which one is better? Well, that depends on a lot of things. What are you expecting from it? Each turn represents, they each have, I think, 19 turns. One has 20 turns, and this one has 19 turns. So they're very similar in their overall look at the Civil War. But each designer has approached the war from a different aspect, and yet they share many things in common. So as I show you things in the Civil War game, I'll make reference sometimes to Mark's game. While I think of it, a fellow named Sean Chick did a very good review on Board Game Geek comparing the three games, Civil War, U.S. Civil War, and For the People. And I highly recommend you read that. It's a very good article comparing all three games. Turn one in Eric's game here begins in July-August of 1861, while Mark Simonich's game he calls early summer, and then there's late summer for turn two. So they have very similar setups. We of course have McDowell at Washington with a large force, but in Eric's game it's not yet an army. It's 7 strength points. We have Beauregard at Manassas Junction, Joseph E. Johnson at near Winchester. One minor difference though, we've got what will become Patterson's force not yet at Harper's Ferry. He's actually on the other side of the Potomac, and there isn't even a named leader in Eric's game. You'll be drawing for those. Forces at Baltimore, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. And what's always interesting to me, because I like studying this campaign, the West Virginia campaign, McClellan begins here with 1 strength point, and these would be the forces that were gathered together under Garnett. So this is simulating the, the Rich Mountain, Cheat Mountain, Philippi races kind of campaign. Grafton is already in Union hands, and the Confederates are trying to contest that. So the openings are similar there. Forces in Raleigh and down here at Fort Sumter. Of course, down at Fort Pickens, Fort Morgan, Mobile, Pensacola. In the West, we have similar situation in both games. Albert Sidney Johnson with a 1 here at Nashville. That's Forts Henry and Donelson, also with a 1. And Mark's game begins in a similar manner. One difference, I'd have to do research on this. I'm not sure who this guy is. This 1 is most likely the forces at Island number 10, but I'm not familiar with this force that begins off to the west. I haven't been able to find it in some of the books I have. We have Polk here at Memphis, and of course this classic standoff way over at Springfield. Lyon on top of a 1 and Price on top of a 2. Notice also the differences in Eric's game here. He has these depot counters, which are not in Mark's game. He handles it a different way. Interesting that the distances are similar. You can be 3 hexes apart in Eric's game and 4 apart in Mark's game. And the way leaders are introduced is quite different in Eric's game here. If you're playing the way the rules state you should be played, the leaders are placed face down. And when you do draw a leader, you'll draw in ignorance. You won't know the exact leader you're going to get. That's quite different in Mark's game. You always know the leader you're going to get, and you're free to place him where you want. Now, the core of the action system is this brilliantly conceived dice differential system. What's different than Mark's game, though, is that you're going to roll 2 dice in Eric's system and compare them. So if the Confederates roll a 2 and the Union an 8, you have a dice differential of 6, and you flip it here to the Union to show that they are moving first. Mark has a similar system, but his goes to 4. Now you might say, well, wow, what happens when you get a dice differential of 10? Well, the big difference in this game is that these differentials and points are used for everything. You're going to actually use these to bring in your reinforcements and move your men. So that's quite a difference than Mark's game. Mark's, you still activate the generals, of course, but with variabilities between 2 and 10, you get a lot more happening in Eric's game. And yet, it's actually slower because you've got different decisions than in Mark's game. For example, in this game, if the Union goes first, what does he do? Should he reinforce Cairo and burn up an action point or one of his dice differential? Or should he move a general like Lyon first? So you're constantly agonizing between this reinforcing or moving men, something that's not in Mark's game, because you've got a built-in phase where reinforcements come in. Activation is similar in both games. As you can see, Price is a 3, so you'd have to burn 3 command points to activate him, while Lyon would only take 2. Polk would also take 3 to activate him. One thing that's different, again, of the two, and was the source of some of the changes that some of the fans wanted to make, or did make, were these red numbers in the middle of certain leaders. For example, Fremont. The red numbers meant that these numbers would favor the enemy. In other words, if Fremont got into a battle with this 3 and he commanded an army, he'd give 3 re-roll options to the enemy. Butler would be the same. You can see Butler's got a 2. McDowell has got a 1. Now at first, even back in A3, I was a little bit unused to that, and I wasn't sure if I liked it. But eventually it grew on me. I began to think of the re-rolls as just like a multi-round battle. So maybe on the first round, enemy did pretty good. You got a re-roll option, and you were able to defeat him. So it's just a mindset, a different way of doing things. One of the criticisms that some of the fans had of the game is one I've seen all across the board in nearly every war game ever produced. And it always has to do with players wanting to do whatever they want. Players, wargamers being wargamers, always want to do everything. They want to be able to do everything. They don't like parameters placed on them. And one of these they didn't like was this reroll option. They said that the net effect was to have leaders like Butler or Fremont just stay in backwater areas and not command like they were supposed to do. Well, that's the game, And for those of you who wanted to keep these kind of leaders in backwater areas, that's your business. You can do so. But you're also ignoring the fact that some of these leaders that aren't the best also have the ability to command armies, which is 3 stars. And there are certain advantages that armies have over individual strength points. But I think some of the modifications they made with adding all these leaders allowed them to command 1s and 2s and were better at commanding them than in armies. And it subtly changed the game. They felt for the better. I don't think so. But that's just my opinion. And I like to play the game as Eric designed it. So I have no trouble with playing with the inferior leaders. That's what Lincoln had to face. So that's what you should have to face in your game. Both designs used similar methods for regulating combat. Eric's combat results table was a bit more complex perhaps, but it was well laid out and had a decent respect for whether you're dealing in a small battle, a medium battle, or a large battle. Mark's game had the same thing. His table was designed a bit different, but the net effect was the same. Now, for the effects of demoralization, there was quite a difference. Now, in Mark's game, if you became demoralized, that was embarrassing enough because you couldn't really engage in offensive combat except for -2 to the dice. In defense, you were just fine. But in this game, Eric's game, if you become demoralized, it's a much bigger deal. You're severely limited with several things. One, you can't attack, and you only roll 1 die in combat, and it's much more severe as you're demoralized in this game. Now, in the appropriate phase, you can rally automatically, as you could in Mark's game. But in this game, if you rallied in that phase, you lose a strength point. So if you wait to rally in that phase, you're losing 5,000 men. Well, how do you rally before that? Well, this is where the command points come in. For example, if Albert Sidney Johnson's army was demoralized and he wanted to rally it immediately, he'd have to spend 3 command points. So the more expensive generals to lead also had to spend more command points to rally. So that was a radical difference from Mark's game. You didn't want to become demoralized if you didn't have to. Poor old General McClellan didn't fare out too well in that category either, which I thought was, well, little sad. Poor old McClellan gets bad reviews in just about every Civil War game produced. In this game, he's 3 to get moving. Okay, that's about right. He gives 1 die roll to the enemy. Yeah, I can live with that. But it's too bad that his rally ability is also only 3. That was where McClellan actually shone. He was able to rally armies in record time, and I think it's too bad it wasn't built into the simulation. But I have seen almost no simulations where McClellan's true abilities are really represented. One thing I liked about Eric's game was he had a bit more respect for the Confederate rail system. As you can see, they show the rail capacity here on the turns. For the Confederacy, it's usually 4. But as you can see, it generally and slowly deteriorates over the years. And that's realistic. The rail system was just not as good as the northern system, and for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into here, but it has to do with different gauge of track, whether the track was double gauged. I mean, the Confederacy was engaged in tearing up their tracks to make ironclads and stuff. So you're talking about a society that was very poor in minerals and resources. They just didn't have the rail capacity that the North did. In Mark's game, they stay pretty well set at 7 for the year. In fact, in '64, some new railroads get built, giving the false impression that the Confederate rail system actually got better, which of course it did not. So the rail system, I think, is depicted a little bit more accurately in this one. Now the blockade in both games is handled in a similar fashion, but in the Civil War, he's gone a step further. As in Mark's game, he's got the ports with the various port capacity, and as the Union gains control of these ports, the imports begin to go down, and these are tracked on the general records track with the import marker. They start at 140, sounds very liberal, but that begins to go down as the Union eats away at the Confederacy. So that part was pretty good. And there was one other aspect too, which I'll show. Now Mark's game handles the blockade with a table, which progressively gets worse and worse for the South as the war proceeds. Now, Eric also has that system in, but it's just done a different way. And it's done by percentage. You can see as the war goes on, the percentage of SP that the Confederate gets goes down too. So it's just a different way of really achieving the same ends. You're not rolling a die there. It just progressively gets worse. Both games feature naval units. Although in Mark's game, he begins with the standard game, which has naval built into the game, but no actual units themselves. In the recent rendition of the game, the 3rd edition, they're separating the advanced naval rules into a separate booklet, which I think is probably a good idea. But in Eric's game, naval units were part and parcel of the whole game. And he had all kinds of different units. He had the riverine units named. He also had riverine units that acted as transports. He also had transports on the ocean. The Confederates got certain ironclads, and the Confederates, which is kind of neat, they got to have their surface raiders, which is usually put in the surface raider box, and they try to eat away at Union points. And in this game, the units faced certain hex sides, so they had the little wee arrow indicating. Of course, riverine units traveled down navigable rivers, and ocean units stayed on the ocean. Now I'll close with one last major difference in the two games, and I don't think I've seen it talked about in any of the reviews. It's not even mentioned, and yet it is so important to each game. Mark's U.S. Civil War has zones of influence, which work like many games we've played many times before. If you enter the zone of control of an enemy unit, you must stop. He has interaction and retreat before combat, all that. But Eric's game here is radically different in one sense. And I have to say it's, in a sense, a bit more realistic. There is no concept of zones of control in this game. For example, if the Confederates are here with 25-mile hexes, when this unit moves into here, there's no way in the world 5,000 men are influencing 5,000 other men 25 miles away. So there is no concept of zones of control, while in Mark's game there is. Now, I'm not taking a backhanded slap at Mark's game. It's one of my favorite games of the Civil War. But you get these embarrassing situations in Mark's game where you'll have a Confederate here, we'll say, okay, and his zone of control extends across the mountain to the other side. Well, anyone who's visited the Shenandoah Valley and stood at the, let's say at Strasburg or something, and looked at the Massanutten Mountain, you realize how helpless you are. You look and go, gee, yeah, I've got a zone of control 25 miles away on the other side of that mountain. No, I don't think so. So that's a radical difference between the two. The zones of influence in Mark's game influenced everything else. But that's built into the combat system and movement system. So it actually works. I'm not saying it doesn't work. It does work. But the concept of having zones of control 25 miles away, I do have trouble with, especially across mountains. So this one, in a sense, is simpler. The other thing about the two games that is quite different is the Costin's movement points. In Mark's game, you more or less move 4 points. You have 4 points, you go 4 hexes. Everything costs 1 hex, except for swamps, which costs 2. Mark's game has a bit more sophisticated movement system in that he gives different movement points for Class 1 rivers that are controlled by the enemy, Class 2 rivers controlled by the enemy. It's a bit more sophisticated movement. But again, that's part and parcel of the way the zones of influence work. So both sides reach the same ends by different means. Now, I'd not really intended that this game be a comparison of Civil War and U.S. Civil War, but it just kind of went that way. But after all, for most of the video, we did show all the components for Civil War, and this was my real aim, to show you a very fine game. Now, there is rumors in the hobby that the game is to be reprinted. I can't confirm or deny those rumors one way or the other. I, for one, wouldn't mind seeing this reprinted at all. But if it is reprinted, I don't mind incorporating the errata and stuff, but I would not want to see all the house rules and fan rules that have been introduced into the game. That would change Eric's vision, and I think his vision of the Civil War was a good one. It's a very accurate simulation of the Civil War. So I do refer you to Stuka Joe's Find videos. You might want to catch that article by Sean Chick. And I hope you have an idea now of what the Civil War game was all about by Eric Lake Smith. Thank you for watching.